Welcome to CASD Distinguished Lecture Series. I am Iveta Silova, who is the Director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Global Education, and we are really thrilled to welcome Professor Martin Carnoy as our distinguished speaker today. Thank you all for joining. There may be a few more people coming, and we have some people also joining by Zoom. We're also recording the lecture, so for those people who are unable to join us today live, they will be able to listen afterwards as well. I would like to thank, first of all, David Berliner for organizing this event and initiating some of the ideas behind this event. So thank you so much, David. So I will do quick introductions, more formal introductions, but actually I wanted to ask also David to maybe say a few more informal introductory words because you know Martin for so much longer. But I will start with more formal part first. Martin Carnoy is a Vita Jacks Professor of Education and Economics at Stanford University. He is a co-director of the Lehman Center at Stanford and a former president of Comparative and International Education Society. And he also is a fellow of the National Academy of Education and of the International Academy of Education. He has written more than 40 books and more than 150 articles on the economic value of education, the political economy of education policy, educational production, and higher education. Much of his work is comparative and international and investigates the way educational systems are organized. Some of the most recent books include Cuba's Academic Advantage, Vouchers and Public School Performance, The Low Achievement Trap, Comparing Schools in Botswana and South Africa, University Expansion in the Changing Global Economy, and the most recent one published last year, Transforming Comparative Education. So many of you have heard Professor Martin Carnoy's name for sure, and most of you have read some of his work. And today we are absolutely thrilled and honored to have the opportunity to meet Professor Carnoy in person and hopefully also have an opportunity to speak more informally afterwards. So thank you for being here.
We have the current president of the CIS, a former president of CIS. Gustavo, you haven't been president yet.
But I actually wanted to ask if David Berliner would say a few more informal words about Professor Carnoy as well.
When Professor Carnoy showed up at Stanford, he had a son that played hockey, and I had a son that played hockey. And we would meet at about two sons. We would meet at about 5 in the morning.
Right.
Two bleary-eyed professors drinking coffee spiked with strange things, and wait at 5 in the morning till 6 or 7 till our kids got off the ice. So we first sort of met informally over that. But I've been an admirer of Martin for years. He's a New Yorker like I am. He has the same kind of pushy style that I had, but mine was Arizona quieted me down a little bit, but it hasn't quieted Martin. And just so you know, we've had controversy in the press over articles that I wrote and that he criticized. And I can't tell you how wonderful it is to have a good critic. You don't have to agree with them. It's a wonderful thing. Martin is an excellent critic, and an excellent critic in our field is needed because there's a lot of crap out there. And he takes people to task, and I have always admired him for being able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. David organized 2 years ago a meeting at the International Academy of Education here at the university. And I just want to say that you have a great group of international educators here. There are 3 in the room here. They're really leaders in their field. So it's a pleasure to be here. My only regret is that usually when I come to a place, about 2/3 of the people were trained at Stanford. They're teaching, and in this case, none was of this group. Of course, Berliner was, and but despite that, they're really great. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, let me tell you why I'm talking about testing. It's not because testing is necessarily bad. I'll explain that. It is because this has become the dominant force today in comparative education, is international tests. It is become the way that countries' educational systems are compared with each other. And I'll explain to you that it's not necessarily a good way to compare countries' educational systems. You don't really get what you can out of understanding differences and even why kids test better or worse in different countries. So, so I'm going to go through this with you because I think it's terribly important. It is a chapter in my new book. I really urge you to read this book. The book is a little bit off-putting for people not at Stanford because it is about what went on at Stanford over 50 years. But there's a reason to write about that because most of the stuff that happened in comparative education over the past 50 years came out of Stanford. Most of the changes in the way to look at comparative education came out of Stanford. I hate to say that, but it didn't all come out of School of Education. But the group at Stanford, small as it was, had a tremendous effect over the years over what happened in comparative education. Of course, there are other people, you know, there's a whole stuff about borrowing, and Teresa does stuff about, has done tremendous stuff on teacher education. And so there's lots of other stuff. I'm just saying that from a paradigmatic standpoint, a lot came out of Stanford. So it's interesting to see that in retrospect, and the book goes through that, because very little of it is taught today, and yet it has not lost its relevance at all. So I hope you guys use the book and make the students learn some theory. It's very important in education to have theory. And I don't mean psychological theory, I mean social theory, because psychological theory you're going to get anyway. So, I mean, the idea, by the way, this contradicts that to a large extent. The idea that the main problem lies with the learning of individual kids, that the main problem, I didn't say that it isn't a problem, that the main way to attack what's not good in education today is to learn more about how kids learn, is, I think, totally off the wall. It's about 20% of the problem. It really, at best. Okay, so that's my ideology. Read the book and see. By the way, the book is cheap. It's very important. You can get it for like $22 from Amazon or from Stanford. So the origins of international testing are very interesting. It happened back in the 60s, and it was an attempt, by the way, by social scientists, even though psychometricians designed the test, the push came from social scientists to get more data on what's going on around the world. That was the original push. Let's really find out what's happening. It isn't just the tests. It's about the surveys of the kids, of the teachers, of the directors of schools. So they want to get more data. And they started back in the 60s with 12 countries. All were in Europe except for Japan and the United States. Those were the only non-European countries, and they tested the kids. It was an enormous project. It cost $1 million, came from the U.S. Department of Education, and went to the University of Chicago. Ben Bloom was the principal investigator, but it was all the psychometricians around the world, and UNESCO was sort of the instigator of it, but UNESCO had no money, so the U.S. Department of Education funded it. It was called the TIMSS, First International Mass Survey, and subsequently there were others in science, etc. And they said from the very beginning that they didn't want it to be league tables. They didn't want comparisons between the countries per se. They were trying to really figure out stuff about education through looking at different countries. That was the intent. And of course, right away, even with the TIMSS, you know who the countries were at the bottom? The bottom 2 countries, can you guess? Out of 12 countries, bottom 2. Anybody volunteer? Bottom, guess?
US.
US, one of them. Who's the other? Sweden. Still score low, both countries, on the test, even today. Okay, on the PISA, Sweden's one of the lower scoring European countries. Okay, so in any case, over the years, starting in the mid-90s, you had the 3rd International Math and Science Survey, 95, which is a very big one. The US was very interested in results, and Bill Schmidt, our colleague from Michigan State, and his group were very influential in taking the US stuff and arguing that curriculum was the problem in mathematics. And they have pushed that idea for a long time. And in part, they're right. In part, they're right. That the US has a real math problem because it teaches math differently from every place else in the world. So that they pushed that idea for a long time, and they're probably partially correct. But then, with the PISA, starting in 2000, OECD got in the game in a very different way. It has really it just burgeoned into something much, much bigger than anybody ever imagined. So I want to make just sort of a caveat. I want to say international testing is not assessment per se. Assessment can be anything. I mean, you can give kids tests in class and you're assessing them. You want to figure out whether you can use assessment very, very productively to figure out what kids are learning and are not learning, okay? So this is not the same thing. We do assessment in education all the time, just like we do assessment in all kinds of stuff to figure out what's going on. And I just want to say that anything I say now about international testing, you really have to separate out from using assessment. I had a student a number of years ago, he's been working for the World Bank for a long time now, Gustavo's compatriota, Luis Benveniste, who wrote a really brilliant thesis about the use of tests in Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina back in around the year 2000. And he showed how differently the tests were used in those 3 countries. And Uruguayans really had the best use of the tests. They actually got the agreement of the teachers because the teachers actually wanted to know the test. Under the conditions that they did it, the teachers actually got to use the test results to figure out what they were doing well and not well. And so that's also assessment. So I just want to make clear that that's true. And by the way, David and I are a little bit on, Dave Leonard and I are a little bit on different sides of this issue. But I think accountability actually for lower income kids has been very effective in certain states, the way it's been used. Because they actually got the teachers 2 things. They got the teachers, we looked at it across the country, but I know particularly what happened in Texas because I studied that in detail. They got the teachers of low income kids actually teaching to the test, which is a terrible thing to say, but it was better than what they were doing. So that's the issue that I've had with it. The assumption is that if left alone, the teachers do better than teaching to the test. Not necessarily true. Not only that, but I was with an organizer in South Texas from the IAF, the Industrial whatever Foundation, a very famous organizing institution. And he told me that the test really had helped him to organize the Latino parents around schools because for the first time, they actually could say that the kids were not doing well. They were not learning what they were supposed to learn. So he could use this as an organizing tool to really put pressure on the schools to do better and very effectively mobilize parents around issues around their kids and help organize a community of Latinos around an issue in South Texas. So that's sort of my experience with that. So it's not a critique of assessment, but there's also good news from these international tests. There is good news. There are two pieces of good news. The good news is that we get lots of data. That was the initial idea of these tests. Bring in data because you're doing lots of surveys of kids and stuff like that. And so you really learn a lot. These questionnaires are quite extensive. And they can help us describe educational systems on many dimensions, including student achievement, school resource system organization, and teacher practices. Not in PISA, but in the TIMSS, there's lots of stuff on teacher practice. Now, of course, it's all self-reported, which leads to some problems, but we've often used self-reported stuff. And so this is very useful for researchers if they follow some methodological rules and don't draw inferences that they shouldn't draw, as I will talk to you about. The bad news is that they're being used, particularly by PISA, to push educational policies based on correlations. Very misleading in many cases. Maybe right, probably not. Okay, and I'll go into some detail on this. And in many cases, they push stuff not even based on empirical evidence, something that just they pull out of their hats in some way and say it's a good policy. The head of the OECD PISA is a very charming German named Andreas Schleicher, who I've decided is very effective because he is tall and has great hair. And his slideshows are really a marvel to watch. And I've seen him in foreign countries, and the slideshow is completely translated into foreign. He speaks in English, but the slideshow is actually in the language of the people watching it. So it's a show. It's a 40-minute show, and but there's a lot of stuff in there at the end that has nothing to do with anything that they have shown, really, empirically. Okay, so that's another bad thing. And they used to understand the PISA. And TIMSS doesn't do this because TIMSS follows NCS rules. Let me explain this to you. I'll talk about it a little bit more. The NCS rules is the NCS can collect, NCS National Center of Educational Statistics. They collect all these data and lots of good data and lots of longitudinal studies. We've used them a lot. All they can do is collect the data and show the general results state by state, you know, on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They can show you which states are there, but they can do no other analysis, not allowed. They have funds, some of you can apply for them if you do quantitative analysis, to actually get money from the AERA to explore these data further. But that's the way it is. And TIMSS does the same thing. TIMSS does not do any of its analysis. They present one book with the results, straight results. Okay? Now, the PISA, before anybody has seen the data, when they release the data, they already have 4 volumes done. They've told you already their analysis of the data. And for most people in the world, that's it. They don't have the capacity to go further. And there's no systematic OECD money to allow you to analyze the data further. Now you can get an OECD fellowship and go to Paris and sit and analyze the data with your group, but it's not independent of their group. So that's very different. And their view of the world is this. If you're scoring high on the test and you're a country, it is A, because of your educational system, and B, it should be emulated. That's it. Therefore, high-scoring countries should be emulated because their educational systems are better because their kids are scoring high on the test. Now, I'll go through that step by step as I do this. So, the main thing is that it implies that those high scores on a test are the result of a good educational system. That's it. And therefore, if the Chinese score high on a test, everybody should run to China and see what they're doing. Okay? And for a while, Finland was scoring high on the test. By the way, it's sort of like Hollywood because it's it's only your latest movie. If they like your latest movie, you're a god. If you do a bad movie, you're in the tank. So, you know, Brad Pitt shows up at the Academy Awards. He's been in the tank for about 10 years. All of a sudden, he's back. You know, so scoring high on the test is great. You're a god. If you score low on the test, after scoring high on the test, nobody talks about it anymore. You're not invited to lunch. So, this argument is largely false. That scoring high on the test it's largely false that you have a good educational system. Not entirely false, it's largely false, okay? We don't know in most cases. So, the second, and Yvette will agree with me, I hope, on this, is that the second premise is that if you see a country scoring high, all you have to do is figure out what they do, and then you can transfer that stuff to your country. Okay? So, borrowing, it's called. And by the way, it's an old tradition in comparative education. You know, all the original stuff in comparative education in the late 19th century, early 20th century, was all about borrowing. People would run around and look and see what the French system was like. You know, we have a Rachel Levine, I think Rachel Levine, a historian who came to Stanford now from North Carolina. She was a Stanford history student at one time. She wrote a brilliant book about what happened between Germany and the United States in higher education back at the end of the 19th century, when the United States borrowed from German Humboldt model, and then the Germans came back and they saw that the private universities in the United States were raising all kinds of endowment money. They wanted to figure out how to do that, etc. So this kind of borrowing's gone on, and it's a very big tradition in comparative ed. And it's correct, there is this tradition, but this is a very important premise of this stuff, that it isn't just borrowing, it is that you must borrow. And you must figure out what to borrow because it's the only way that you're going to actually advance your educational system. You have to figure out, if you're scoring low, you must figure out why those high scoring countries are scoring high, and then you must adopt those practices. Okay. Now, I'm going to argue that that is largely not true. And by the way, the borrowing literature also says it's largely not true. It's very, very difficult to take stuff from one educational stuff from one context to another. And that is because educational systems are largely a reflection of the society. The educational system are not just the schools. Educational systems are a much broader set of activities and traditions. Okay, it's a reflection of the society. Okay, so the last point is already raised, that they really do the analysis based. They present their analysis before anybody's had a chance to sort of review this and do their own analysis. So the last point I want to make about this is that there's a lot of stuff of policy analysis, totally uncausal. And I'm going to give you some great examples here. A, This is one you can read it for yourself. Can everybody see this from the back? Is it large enough? Yeah. So this Norwegian schools example, I love this. Anybody been to Norway? Yeah? Okay. What do they care about test scores? Who cares? In general, who cares about test scores in Norway? It's a very rich, well-organized place where, except for it's cold and dark for a lot of the years, it's like you have everything, you know? Nobody's poor. Social welfare system is terribly well organized. Everything is well organized. And they're just swimming in oil money, you know? So they came up with this thing, okay? There's no empirical evidence for this. It just pulled out of the hat in 2008. This is from the PISA report, okay? Second example. This is much longer, but I'm not going to. This is the Hanashek study. Do you know who Hanashek is? Rick Hanashek from Stanford. So they came up with this correlation between test scores. You know, it's very sophisticated statistic. It's not sophisticated at all, actually, but they ran a correlation between test scores and growth rates over 50 years. No Eastern European countries in that analysis because they don't have growth data for Eastern European countries before 1990. So they happen to be high scoring, low growth places on average. Now Poland's been high growth since then, but the other countries not so much. So you have high scoring, low growth places. You include those after 1990, and you get very different results from 1990 on, okay? Also, you have Latin America, which is low growth, low scoring. And why is that? It has nothing to do with education. It has to do with overborrowing in the 70s and collapse in the 1980s for a long period of time, almost 20 years. So very low growth state. So there's all these other factors, but they do this kind of stuff. And by the way, the OECD and the World Bank have bought into this 100%. They go around running around saying, if you just increase your test scores, you're going to increase your growth rates. Just total nonsense. Okay? Here's some of the problems. All these are cross-section test scores. They're cohorts, right? So there's a cohort, 15 years old in PISA, or 8th grade and 4th grade in TIMSS, and they take the test in, let's say, the year 2003. Happens to be both TIMSS and PISA that year. They take a test. Okay, so everything's cross-section. You have an observation of a test score on a kid, and in the case of PISA, you don't even have any teacher observations, only what the kids tell you about the teachers. There are some questions about that. And then you have some stuff about the schools. And they have a lot of information about the kids. So they, first of all, publish the results, plain and simple, without any information besides the test score. Then they just look at the countries. Then they do some stuff by gender, probably also incorrect. I'll tell you about that in a second, somewhat incorrect. Somewhere in end of volume 1 or sometimes in volume 2, you get a correction for social class of the kids, which is very hard to read. It's a table with dots over bars, and it doesn't, I mean, I have a hard time reading. Anyway, so they do that. And then they make all kinds of inferences about decentralization, autonomy of schools, all kinds of stuff that is totally, really just based on cross-section analysis. That's a very big problem. It's not value-added. So these are benchmark tests, and you can't even tell. I mean, you can in the latest PISA, it's very interesting. If you go to the page, you can go country by country, and they show you all the test scores that they have for all three tests over time for each country. It's a very interesting thing to look at. And they try to draw a curve through it, up, down, up and down, up, down and up. Anyway, you can look at that. But you have no reason, no information to understand why they behave that way. Okay, why they're flat, why they go up, why they go down. No, there's nothing in there that explains that. Okay. And what they do is instead, they feature all the time countries that go up. And they never talk about countries that go down. And a very big chunk of countries go down on the test. Okay? So that's all they can tell you. And they're comparing countries across cultures, across political systems. And they actually publish stuff. Then they publish in the first volume now, didn't always occur, but now in the first volume, recommendations. Right at the end of the first volume, recommendations based on a test. Based on what? That's the question. Based on what kind of empirical analysis? It's a very big problem. And so finally, they leave out, by the way, all non-educational stuff. They do not discuss, they have questions in the student questionnaire about how much time you spend taking courses outside of schools. Okay, they have some of those questions. But that's all student reported. Finally, there are countries, a number of them, in the analysis, which are federal countries, like the United States. And there is no such thing as the US education system, A. So publishing data about the United States as a whole is a completely invalid exercise. Because the US federal government has basically nothing to say about K-12 education except to give money for Title I. That's it. And get people in the schools to file papers justifying their Title I money. And that's about it. They can jawbone, they can bully pulpit about schools, et cetera, and they can promote certain policies, and they can give incentives with big grants to do certain stuff, but fundamentally the states are in control of the education system, okay? So, to one degree or another, the US is an extreme example, but to one degree or another, there are lots of countries like this. Brazil, Russia, many of them are centrally funded, but basically the states, the capacity at the state level is what drives the system. Even Mexico, which is almost totally centrally funded. There are degrees of autonomy, depending on the level of income in the state, but basically states are in charge. And the same thing is true in Argentina and in Germany. Lots of federal countries, large federal countries. China's not a federal country, by the way. A very big country, but highly centralized. So making comparisons on the basis of countries in many of these cases is wrong. And occasionally you will see that the test has been given in a state, like in Nuevo León or in Mexico or some other. I'll talk about China in a minute. China's a very interesting example. So here's another problem, and that is that the two tests often give different results. Not always, but often give different results. So this is the case of Australia, which we wrote a paper on Australia, which you might want to read. It's a very interesting paper. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But the long and the short of it is we asked policymakers in Australia why they thought the test scores had gone down since the year 2000 to the year 2015 by a third of a standard deviation in math. A third of a standard deviation is huge, by the way. And they asked them for reasons. So we tested every one of the reasons, and we could not support any of them. None of them explained what it was. And everything they believed about what was going on, not everything, but most of what they believed about the system was wrong. So here's another problem. Look, the TIMSS scores go way down. It's dotted because there was no TIMSS test in 2009. I mean, it went from 2007 to 2000. It's every 4 years, so 2011. So you can see the TIMSS test went down and up in math. And then the PISA scores just go down. Okay, two different tests. Of 8th graders versus basically 9th graders, 9th and 10th graders. So this is also inexplicable. And there are two different measures of mathematics ability and two different samples, but both supposedly random. By the way, Australia is another federal country, 8 states, also autonomous in their decision making. However, the Australian government does have a lot to say about funding. Now, here's the United States with TIMSS and PISA. Okay. Now, I want to make another point here by doing this. The solid line is the line adjusted for changes in the sample of social class kids, the social class composition of the sample over time. And the early samples, 1999 and 2000, were much higher social class than subsequent samples. So when you correct the scores, the observed score is the high score, 490. That's the reported score. But in fact, when you adjust for social class across time, that score goes way down because those kids were higher social class than later. And the same thing's true of the PISA. Okay, so what looks like a tremendous decline in the PISA scores is basically flat. Okay, this is in math. And the TIMSS, on the other hand, rises quite a bit from 490 to 520. So that's a third of a standard deviation increase in math. Okay, nobody talks about that. By the way, the NAEP shows even larger gains at 8th grade. Okay, so but at least TIMSS and NAEP now are sort of have been made equivalent, so you can get a TIMSS score for every state since 2011. So so this shows that both social class adjustments and test scores can show different results. Okay. We should never, here's another case, the unfortunate story of Finland. This is Hollywood gone bad for Finland. People still go to Finland, visit Finland because they like it, but there is no more reason to visit Finland because look what happened to the test. You don't want to go to Finland. It's losing. Look, it's a loser. These are the math scores, and these are adjusted to the 2003 books in the home weights. Books in the home is called Family Academic Resource. It's as good as, for these kind of countries, it's as good as anything. And everybody answers the question. That's the most important. Gotta be very careful what social class variables you use, mainly because mother's education and father's education, 1/3 of the kids don't even bother to answer the question, or they misanswer it. For example, in 2006, Brazil, 30% answered that their parents had university education, when in fact the percentage in the society was 11%. Okay, so it's a bad variable. But in any case, books in the home is much better, especially for developed countries. So these are adjusted to the 2003 books in the home. So the sample is adjusted for that. So it's as if you're looking at the test scores of kids in 2015 as if they were the same social class composition as the kids in 2003. Okay, same in the US. So math went down a little bit in the US, but it went much further down in Finland. I asked Schleicher about this because, after all, he's on top of this test. So I said, what's going on in Finland? By the way, it continues down after 2015, went down again in 2018. It's a big change. And he said, we've noticed something about what's going on in the early grades. Come on. Anyway, so no explanation. That's the point. A small amount of immigration increase, small amount of immigration increase, this definitely does not explain this. Now, this is with reading. So you see a smaller change in Finland, but a rise in the United States, all social class adjusted. So far as reading is concerned, all the Finns should be visiting the United States. Figure out why the test scores are going up and they're not, and they're going down, right? I mean, if we really believed in educational tourism, that's the direction that it should take. Okay, so I think Finnish society is much more pleasant than US society in terms of its social policies, et cetera. And by the way, explains a lot of why the Finnish test scores are higher. One of the problems is, as I'll explain later, is, let me just go through this, because actually 3 states took the PISA in 2012. I don't believe since, but that was a math year. So look at this. This is really interesting. It's math and reading score. Blue line is math, the red line is reading. Now, this is my case. This is my story about federal countries. Look at the variation between Florida and Massachusetts on math. Okay, it's huge. In reading, it's less, but it's still there. And look at Massachusetts reading scores compared to every place, all these other countries, including Korea, high-scoring country. Massachusetts higher. This is all social class adjusted. In math, Massachusetts high as Finland. That difference is not significant. High as Finland and Canada, both considered very high-scoring countries. Not as high as Korea, but the explanation Korea could be very different. May have nothing to do with the education system. But the point is that Massachusetts does well compared to everybody except Korea. In this case, I mean, there are other countries like Singapore, you know, and China, et cetera, Taiwan, that score high like Korea. And, but Massachusetts up there, okay? Florida's not. Florida's much lower. This is all social class adjustment. Okay? So the intranational comparisons might be more useful in many cases than international comparisons. So the trips that you guys should be taking should be to Massachusetts. Maybe not even to Massachusetts, maybe to Texas, because Texas does very, very well math. Lately, I'll show you that it's not the case anymore, but certainly makes more sense than going off to Europe or Asia to see what a state with a similar population of kids, what they've done differently from what you've done. Okay, same basic idea of education. Okay, same more or less curriculum looks similar, etc. And what do they do that is different? So these federal intra-country comparisons are very, very useful. We've done them in US and Brazil. And in some countries, we have longitudinal data on student achievement that can be linked to teacher and school data, which is much more useful for policy than international tests. We have the same kids. So we can see what's happening to the same kids across the grades. We can follow their trajectories. We can see, are there schools that are doing a better job of bringing the kids along, or better districts or better states in doing, what are the policies that help these kids? And those are value-added estimates. Those are trajectory estimates on the same kids, aggregated, which is far, far better than looking across sections. Okay, to be able to isolate what happens to kids at different levels of initial performance and see what works for them in terms of teacher practices, in terms of school management practice, et cetera, or even larger management practices. So here is Massachusetts versus Connecticut. two rather similar states. And these are cross-section data, not longitudinal data. They're longitudinal in the sense that it's the NAEP. It's taken across time. The solid lines are adjusted for US, they're all just US social class. So since Massachusetts and Connecticut are much higher social class kids on average than the whole average in the United States, both adjusted scores are moved down. But look at the difference of what happened in these two states, neighboring states, between 2003 and 2013. There's a phenomenal difference in mathematics, a half a standard deviation in 10 years. So Massachusetts did something that Connecticut did not do, okay? And this is worth much more study than trying to figure out how the United States compares with Finland or with China. Because this tells you something, okay? I mean, you'd have to do qualitative analysis and figure out what happened. But the fact is that this kind of stuff is much more relevant for policy than running off and doing international comparison. Because whatever happened in Massachusetts is much more borrowable for Connecticut, right? I can tell you some of the things that Massachusetts did do. In the 90s, they spent a lot more money than Connecticut. They really increased the amount of spending much faster than Connecticut. They put in the mathematics standards of the late 80s, taught teachers how to teach them. And by the way, it's not easy in Massachusetts because there are a lot of small school districts. So it's not, like big counties like in Florida. A lot of small districts, so it's much harder to manage that system, and yet they did it. So we should figure out what happened there in detail. Here's the people in Linda Darling-Hammond is now the chair of the state education, the Board of Education, and Mike Kurtz, both my colleagues at Stanford, who was during the 8 years of Jerry Brown, that position. They love this graph. Okay, so because Texas has had this tremendous increase in math scores, and we kind of know why it happened. And sort of California floundered around. You can see it went down, up and down. But recently, California, some things happened in Texas. We think it's the Tea Party is driving this thing down. Okay, they're just not doing the stuff that they did back in the 80s and 90s, where Ross Perot and company really pushed the state legislature and made big investments in education, big changes, particularly in math education. So it's really interesting. California is now making a big push to do a coordinated effort to get the teachers to teach the Common Core. They suspended the test for 3 years, etc. So this is very interesting to study this kind of stuff. Anyway, to summarize, comparing average unadjusted for SES student test scores and the student teacher and teacher variables across countries can give us considerable information, but are not very useful to understand why these changes are taking place, if there are changes taking place. Okay. And it doesn't tell you very much why they differ, why the educational systems differ. What is different about them? It used to be a main study in comparative education. What is different about these education systems? How do these countries differ, and why do they differ? Where's it coming from? What are the sources of this stuff? Is it state policy? Is it family, something that's been ingrained in family culture? I don't like to use the word culture very much, but we have to admit that there are cultures built around education. I'll give you a sort of a family example. Not the son that played hockey the longest, but the older one who now has 4 children. He was quit hockey at 12 years old because he wanted to focus on soccer. So he's a maniac about soccer. He played college soccer. He wants all his kids to be superstars in soccer. Anyway, so it's really insane. But they, I tell them, you should be sending your kids to math camp, not to soccer camp in the summer. I mean, you got to compete, you know, with the people going to math camp. Because I don't care about math camp. Anyway, I want them to be good at soccer. They'll learn math on their own. In China, they said, even the Asian kids in the United States are saying, I have Asian American students 25 years ago from New York going to math camp in the summer. That's what they did every summer, went to math camp. Not now, but I'm talking about a generation ago. And who invented this stuff? Who invented, I had another student, a Korean American, she'd have to get up with her two sisters every morning at 5 o'clock to practice cello and violin. You got the choice of cello or violin. But once you made that choice, every morning, 5 o'clock before school, you had to practice for an hour. Then you got breakfast. And that's definitely different, okay? There are other groups of people that do that, but you have to identify that as part of something happening outside of school, okay? It's identifiable. And just to tell you a very interesting factoid, that Massachusetts PISA score that I showed you, the self-identified Asian origin kids, covers a huge gamut, South Asians, you know, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, covered a lot of people. They scored at 5% in Massachusetts, scored as high as the kids in Singapore on the PISA, in Massachusetts, okay? So that gives you a clue that there's something else going on besides the educational system. Because the average kid in Singapore scores higher, considerably higher in math than in Massachusetts, but not the Asian, self-identified Asian kid. So they draw unsubstantiated policy conclusions from a lot of stuff, which is distorting, I think, very gravely the way people think about how to improve educational systems. Okay, you don't just run off to Shanghai and say, let's do what the kids in Shanghai do. I'll tell you about Shanghai in a minute bit. So this has drawn attention away, in my mind, from using these big data sets to figure out sort of what's going on. Even if it's not causal, at least descriptively, what is happening? It diverts. The OECD also has a strange philosophy, which is that social class cannot be a barrier to improving education results for kids. A very nice philosophical standard thing. But what it does in practice is to say that social class is not a barrier. It moves from can't be to is not, okay, which is a falsehood, okay? So from a nice ideal, which we should all adopt, that we should never say that your social class should be a barrier to being well educated and high achieving in school. Two, it is not a barrier. You can do anything you can do just through the educational system. That's a false. That's a very bad kind of policy conclusion, because we know it's not true, but you have to do a lot more. Finland, for example, before any kid enters schools in Finland, they've had on the average 5 years of very expensive, well-organized, well-staffed early childhood education. I've seen it. It's the most expensive in Scandinavia, even in Scandinavia. And to not talk about that is crazy. Before they walk into at 7 years old into first grade, they've gone through a very enriching experience. Every kid in Finland, by the way, the differences in class in Finland are much smaller than in other places. They're only, I think, about 4%, even with new immigration, only 4% poor kids in Finland. In the United States, it's over 20%. So it's a different world. different world, and to not focus on that is misleading, just misleading. So it would be much more useful and illuminating for comparative education to go back to basics and try to understand why kids really do test high in some places and not in others. What's the reason? Is it focus on tests? Is it something to do with really that they teach better the math and reading or whatever? Is it really that? Is it something about that? Or is it other things? Very important to understand that. And if we had the right attitude toward these data, we would be doing that. And then also, it would be very interesting to come up with new theories of comparing student learning across nation states and subregions of nation states. Try to really understand, how do we compare student learning? Do we just look at these tests? Do we look at what's happening in their lives, through their families, et cetera? Take a more careful look at these things and look beyond to social capital, culture, and where and how students engage to acquire the knowledge that they get. Okay, it's very different in different societies, I think. And there's a lot of variation, and nobody's looking at that. If you just say, "Oh, you just got to do something in your schools," you're forgetting that all this other stuff is happening. We know in the United States, for example, that in schools, more or less the trajectories of lower and higher social class kids are very similar in school, while they're in school. But in the summers, they're different, okay? And a lot of the increasing gap that occurs, according to Alexander and Entwistle in the study that they did in Maryland, it's very clear, and nobody seems to pay much attention to this. It seems to be pretty important to do something outside of school and in the summertime. And finally, I think learning theory can be helpful to tell us new ways, not so much about how kids learn, but how to measure what kids learn, so that we can come up with different ways to see what's going on. We should certainly measure different types of learning, because to me it's amazing. With all the complaints, even Hanashek says that the US is an anomaly. The fact is, I tell you a little anecdote. So I was with Schleicher on a two-person panel, Schleicher and I, on this panel. He got to talk 40 minutes, I 20 minutes, okay. But no, you don't need that much time to say it. So, in fact, if you look at Schleicher's slides, it's impossible to tell what happened after the slideshow. But what I did want to draw attention to in this particular instance was his last slide. In his last slide, he showed the following, which totally astounded me. He showed Russia and the US, and he showed Russia test scores in math higher than the US. Not all that much higher, but higher. And Russian productivity way down here, and US productivity way up here. So my eyes got wide, and when he finished talking, which was just a few minutes later, I said to the audience, I said, you have not, I don't think you've comprehended what you've just seen. You've just seen the head of PISA tell you that your productivity problem is not related to your math test scores. I said, do you fully understand what that means? It means that to solve your productivity problem, investing more in math scores is not going to help you. You should go to the US and figure out why their productivity is high, because their test scores are lower than yours. Okay? And you'll find that has nothing to do with schooling, because you have high schooling, high attainment, higher than in the US, and you have higher math test scores, and yet your productivity is terrible. So what do you have to do? Well, you probably have to change the entire political economic system. You probably have to do that, okay? And you may not want to change it. You may want to just go along with low productivity, but that's what you got to do. And look, as an economist, it's just ridiculous to say. I mean, obviously, I believe that human capital makes a difference, and test scores are a measure of human capital. But the fact is that human capital is not the only thing that enters into an economic growth picture or an economic or the society as a whole. Okay, it is not the only thing. It may be not even that important. Over the long run, it may be important, but certainly over 20, 25-year periods, it's not that important. The US is a case of that. We have high growth rates for a developed country, and we have relatively low test scores, and our attainment could be higher. We're not the highest attaining country anymore. So we should think about that as educators. We should think about the role of the structure of society. We should think about what the society is really trying to achieve with the resources that it has and who is trying to achieve it for. Okay, so all these things should be entered into this, and we should really try to measure what it is about US kids that makes them more productive, or their ability to be more productive, even though people claim you can't teach them anything because don't have high enough test scores. Apparently, Toyota can come in and hire people in Tennessee and teach them to be pretty productive, right? So somehow we have to figure that out. We as educators have to figure that out as part of the. So I did want to just tell you about China, the high test scores in China. Are you aware that there are only 4 Chinese cities in the Chinese urban areas in the current PISA, right? Now, shouldn't that raise questions to start with? How does China get to put in only 4 urban areas into the PISA? By the way, all on the East Coast and richer, and not include the masses of rural kids in the poor areas. How does that happen? This is supposed to be, I'm sorry.
It's China.
This is a more complicated to turn this phone. Got to push 2 buttons to do it. So the question is, how does that happen? It raises other questions. First of all, the Shanghai sample was finally admitted that it was not representative after a guy at Brookings went after them for a long, long time. And it really destroys the validity of these international comparisons. If a country is allowed to determine what kids are measured in the test, and by the way, probably within those cities, there's also a lot of hanky-panky going on. Okay, so the question is, why does an OECD, as supposedly an organization which is totally based on legitimacy, totally. They have no money except for their own civil servants. They never pay any of their consultants, I can tell you about that. And it's all done, they can go into a country and people just run around doing anything OECD wants. And it's all based on legitimacy. So why would an agency that's totally based on legitimacy allow this kind of thing to happen? It's very interesting. I think it's an interesting question in and of itself. And people are examining, people like Karen Mundy, et cetera, about that kind of stuff, about the role of international organization and what role they're playing in sort of global society. So I think that we as intelligent academics should not simply discard these data, but rather try to use them to try to understand what's going on and also push for changes, obviously. But my own view, and this is kind of off the wall, is I think because the test scores aren't going up regularly in these tests, it's going to kill them. It's bad. It's not good for them. Because if the test scores aren't regularly going up, then what are they going to do? Report every time, oh, the test scores didn't go up. You know, but after a while, people are going to say, well, why do we take this test? It's not cheap, by the way. US spends millions just to their contribution, just for the PISA test. So they're very influential, very important. I don't know how much they drive policy, but certainly they play a driving policy. And the question is for us is how can we use this stuff to further other goals? And that's what I would say is your challenge. That's it.
Martin, the U.S. News and World Report came out with a ranking of nations that was almost test-free. It was based on reputation, the ability of lower-class kids to get a decent education, the ability of lower-class kids to go to college. And a strange thing happened. I don't know if you noticed. Number one in the world was the U.S. educational system.
No, Ken, I didn't see that.
Yeah, it was just recently. Japan, the first Asian country on the list, was number 11.
Really?
Yes.
When did this come? When did this come out?
It's 2020 data, so last 2 months.
Oh, really?
U.S. News and World
Wow.
Report. Yeah. But my point to all of you is that U.S. News and World Report did not rely on things like PISA. It relied on reputational data. Now
That includes university, I think.
Yeah. It's got its own faults. It's got some horrible faults. It was easy to spot them. But the issue is they used a different set of criteria and came up with a completely different arrangement of states, countries rather. And I thought it was fantastic.
But
Canada was
it's interesting because I think it's due to the U.S. higher education.
Yeah.
But that raises a very interesting issue because after all, the highest age which is tested in these international tests is 15 years old.
Yeah.
Okay, now they have another survey which is called PISA, which tests adults. And they show that the adults, by the way, score about the same as the kids in terms, I mean, US adults don't do very well on the PISA test, which is, by the way, another test of certain kinds of knowledge. So on the adult survey, the US should be just doing terribly, and because they score lower on this test. But if US News and World Report, and I think once you include the university system, you include the fact that the US, by the way, like Russia and some other countries, is heavily higher educated. And so, but unlike Russia, the US definitely postpones learning into post-secondary education and basically gives kids freedoms that other countries don't have. I mean, maybe some people argue too much freedom, but the fact is that they get to do a lot of other stuff besides simply studying for tests. And I think the other thing is that I think it's very interesting to try to understand how particularly Asian societies, which goes from Vietnam, it doesn't include Indonesia, but Vietnam all the way north to in East Asia, how they're able to get their kids to just be totally devoted to studying how to take tests for so many hours a day from a fairly early age all the way to the end of high school. And of course, the universities, as we now have data, you know, we have a big study going on at Stanford, a value added by my colleague, young colleague, Prashant Loyolka, in which he has 4 countries now, India, China, US, and Russia in it, and shows that Chinese engineering and computer science students basically don't learn anything while in university. Their math scores actually go down between the time they enter and the time they end. So, which by the way, is not surprising since nobody fails a course in China. You have the students, if a professor dares to fail a bunch of students, they attack the professor physically. Anyway, and basically he ends up saying that in terms of a computer scientist, that the US produces the most knowledgeable computer scientists in the world at the end of the day. And they start out with much lower math scores than the Chinese. So, and you know, the famous story about Tokyo University, the main thing you learn there is play golf. You know, learn to schmooze with your fellow.
Martin, you are one more voice criticizing with caveats the use of this test.
The way the tests are being used.
The way. So, how do you explain that, you know, we went from 12 countries in the 60s to over 90 now? Governments pay really good money to participate in the test. This has an issue of legitimation.
Yeah.
You know, because they are being used.
Yeah.
In very different ways, because, you know, countries, you know, adjust or, you know, create or borrow policies. But you know, what explains the success
Of those tests?
Yes.
Okay. Well, of course, there is the Meyer-Ramirez explanation of world society theory that says this is a symbol of being modern, of modernity, so everybody wants to come in. And then there are other explanations, such as Karen's, Mondays, and Ria Kijima, who now is also Toronto. Her thesis showed that international agencies and bilateral agencies basically funded the countries to take those tests as part of pushing them to do more assessments, okay, and World Bank. So the funding comes from the international organizations to the lower income countries to get them to take tests, not all of them, but if they agree to take the test, Ria showed, there was a spike in foreign aid the year after they agreed to take the test. Have you seen this stuff? Published stuff. So I think that's very interesting empirical data.
Yeah, but it's very uneven. You know, in Latin America, for some countries works.
Yeah, but there are only 7 countries in Latin America that agreed to do this, and I don't think they're having a happy time with it. Peru is having a happy time with it because their test scores are going up, but everybody else's aren't going up. But I'll tell you what it's gone down to. Sobral in Ceará, right? The town that scores, the municipality scores the highest on the test, even those in the national test, even though it's very poor. 16 of their high schools took the PISA for schools. Do you know about PISA for schools? It's a test that individual schools can take. All you need is 75 kids, 15 years old in your school, and you'll get enough statistical power to compare yourself with Singapore. Now, they took this test and they didn't do very well on it. They did about the same level as Colombia, you know. So they were pretty disappointed. But it was, I'm not sure how accurate it is, but you're right. There's this move to legitimize yourself by taking this test. But well, it's group thing, you know. It's
My Mexican colleagues from the government told me when we were doing the tests and study, Mexico dropped because OECD had developed the TALIS study. And so they threatened them, the OECD threatened them to kick them out of the OECD if they didn't take the TALIS. So they didn't care if they took the test, but budget was limited, right? So Mexico ended up deciding to take the TALIS because they don't want to be kicked out of OECD. So it's also like a symbol of prestige to belong to this organization. I don't know for what reason.
Maybe,
that's kind of like
but maybe just curiosity, you know, maybe how like they did in Ceará, they were just curious to know how they compared. So someone gave money to do that, and they did it.
But I wanted to address David's issue here with the different criteria, right? And this is something you know about the HALO project. So the OECD, they designed this huge project to measure the outcomes of universities.
In economics and engineering.
Yeah, and
Economics
also
and
more
electrical
general,
engineering.
also more general tests. So it was economics, engineering, and more general tests
Yeah.
as to the outcomes of higher education. And so they did this in the 15th.
They never did it. They ran a pilot.
No, they had a pilot. They started with that, developed all the instruments and all of that, and then the American Association of Universities and also Canadian universities wrote a very angry letter to the Secretary of OECD saying that this was a completely invalid test and they were not going to go with that. And so this is my presentation for CIS, the one I'm taping. So basically, you know, the project never moved forward because there was a big movement of universities saying, no, this is an attack to autonomy and you know, you just look at the model that they have, right?
To tell you the truth, I don't take the side of the university.
But the universities. But the thing, this gets better. The thing is, the Times of Higher Education published an article with an angry person from Australia who had been leading this study, saying that the universities, they're portrayed like buffaloes, blocking progress, you know, like blocking cars, and just saying that, you know, the test will be an attack against the oligarchy of universities. And Schleicher published an article where he said that what he was doing was challenging what the US and US report, you know, that criteria. So not based on prestige, but based in that value.
Yeah, but Teresa, step back a second. The fact, you're right.
I'm just
The
saying
autonomy of the universities stops all this kind of stuff because they don't want to cooperate. Now, you can argue that's a great thing, but the fact is universities don't want to be evaluated under any circumstances. And I'll tell you, I usually don't care about these things, but here's what universities do in this country. They refuse to give data to the NCS about what happens to their graduates. Well, that's bad because people are spending a lot of money to go to university. If the university doesn't have to tell anybody what is happening to its graduates, doesn't have to be compared with anybody else in terms of what happens, you can make some pretty bad choices. I mean, I told my daughter, go where it feels the best, okay, because you got to spend 4 years there. But that's also good advice, but it would be great if you would also know what happens to the graduates, okay? So the business schools do a little bit of a better job, but the fact is that universities refuse. And they certainly don't want value added. And we did a study now, we have data in Brazil, strangely enough, that we can do value added. And they're hard to get because they're centralized in the agency and they don't want to give it out. But someone gave us a set of data for 1 year and we were able to measure value added. And what we found was that the bottom 20%, that if you do a propensity score matching, so they actually match kids even on their entrance test scores and their social class between approximate 20% of what's it called? Selectivity, 20% selectivity. You divide into 5 groups of selectivity of the universities based on entrance test scores, which covers, you know, in Brazil, 70% of kids go to private universities, so it covers from some pretty good public and a few private universities, all the way down some terrible places. The bottom, there's not much difference across different programs of study at the top, but at the bottom 20%, if a similar student would go to 20% higher selectivity university, and this is propensity score matching, so they could have gone to a 20% higher university. they would score significantly higher on their final outcomes, but significantly higher value added. And we had another study show they also earn a lot more, significantly more. Well, right now the Brazilian government's giving subsidies to all these private universities for low-income kids. And they shouldn't be giving them to the bottom 20% of universities. Just shouldn't be giving it to them because they are really hurting those kids. So it's important to know this stuff from a policy standpoint. Should be value added, should be gains across lots of kids. American universities should be subject to this, and there have been studies in the past of this kind of stuff, but they've been very expensive and very hard to mobilize because the universities resist all this kind of stuff. So I'm not against assessment. I'm just against using data in ways that they weren't meant to be used and giving bad results. I mean, giving incorrect policy results and steering people in the wrong direction. I think we have to separate out those two things. It's wrong, as David has argued again and again, and I couldn't agree with him more. You should not be evaluating teachers based on value-added data for 1 year. That's crazy. It's really crazy. And he said you can't evaluate teachers or universities or anybody on stuff that they're not doing, that isn't in their objective function. You got to evaluate people about what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, and the same with teachers. If you just give teachers a value-added test without having something to do with what they've been told to do, it's bad evaluation. That's something else. But
that's the very problem with the OECD wanting to evaluate universities, because universities
well,
are
they
not
just
a
had
monolith.
well, they only also had just an end test. They just had an end test. They didn't have an initial test. We had the entrance test score in Brazil with these kids, and then the final test. Now, there's problems with the final test in Brazil because it's not high stakes. An initial one is high stakes. There are all kinds of issues, but you got to be careful with this stuff, and you got to tell the story. But at the same time, I'm not against having data which help people make better policy decisions. But this is not what's happening here. What's happening here is that data is being used in a way that does not advance the cause of policy. And the proof of the pudding is that they cannot explain why test scores go up, and they cannot explain why they go down over a long period of time. They just can't. And if you can't do it either way, test is useless.
Yeah, the OECD is back at it again. So they are doing their benchmarking exercise for universities.
Oh,
The results to be published 2020.
But Prashant Loyoka has done it already for 4 countries in a good way. He actually follows the students from the first year to last year. Go ahead.
So this kind of reminds me, and this is a 3rd grade example, but I think you might appreciate it. I worked at a school 1 year where there were 4 classrooms, and we were assessed 3 or 4 times a year, I can't remember. And we were pitted against each other, and as teachers, like based on our test scores. So the very first test, I had the lowest scores. I wasn't too worried about it. I had 11 kids.
Lowest gains? Lowest gains?
No, lowest on test number 1, just right off the
lowest
bat,
scores,
I had
I
the
mean.
lowest scores. Yeah. Test number 2 comes along, I still have the lowest scores, and they're getting concerned. They said, okay, well, you need to go and look at the teacher number 1 and teacher number 2
Yeah.
and model after them. Well, teacher number 1, she said, well, I don't have any kids with special needs in my class, so I can't help you. I just don't do special needs. They don't give them to
This
me.
is that composition of class difference.
Yeah, teacher number 2, all she did was worksheets. She was brand new. She totally taught to the test. And I just kind of kept doing my thing, but there was all this pressure on me to be like them. Ironically, by the time they actually took, this was back in when they did the AIMS, my 3rd graders had the highest test scores, but they weren't willing to wait for that process. And that's the frustrating thing, because you can see these test scores, but if you jump to the wrong conclusions, the wrong kinds of teaching methods are going to be espoused instead of
Well,
effective.
your school district had the same problem as the OECD.
Exactly.
That they simply didn't know how to use assessment in order to make judgments. And this is, however, and so this is a conundrum. If most, and this is why teachers' unions are often against assessments, because they know that the administrators are going to misuse them. Okay, so you can't be against that, right? But on the other hand, it's a shame in a way, because we know that you can use assessments in a good way. We know that. And why don't we train people to do that, you know, instead of saying, oh, we're just not going to measure anything. Okay, so that's, but you're right. If you know that the people in charge have no clue how to use this correctly, yeah, you should oppose it. No question about it.
Martin and I both knew a great measurement person, Lee J. Kronbach, who I studied with, and one of his specialties was validity. So when I confront the test, I always ask questions about validity. And one of the things he always taught was predictive validity. The test is supposed to predict something. And I remember him teaching us that there wasn't a single test he knew of that predicted more than a year or two in advance anything. And the IQ test, which everybody thinks of as predicting something, turns out to have a correlation of about 0.3 with any status measure you can name at 50 years of age. So, I mean, it just doesn't predict well. So PISA, I mean, we know, we're not sure it predicts anything, as you said. The other thing is content validity. And when I see a test, I ask, you know, how do I know that it's, PISA's measuring problem-solving skills, and in math and science, let's say, but TIMSS does the same, and they don't correlate well. Well, it's a construct validity problem. One, the other, or both are missing the constructs of interest, which is math ability and reading ability. So just looking at validity when you're faced with a test, to think about validity becomes very important for just trying to interpret the results.
But TIMSS, it's correlated with the curriculum that the schools teach.
Well, that's why I'm talking about TIMSS and PISA.
Okay, that's why they
The correlation is not high.
Yeah.
And Martin showed one goes up, one goes down.
Yeah.
If the correlation is high, but they're both claiming math, fundamental math ability, one or both of them is not doing it.
Well, we actually, in Russia, there's only one case in the world, and we did it. We convinced the agency in Russia that gives the international tests does both of them. So we convinced that international agency, through personal contact, to give the PISA test in 2012 to the entire TIMSS sample of 2011, a year earlier. Because one's an 8th grade test and one's sort of a ninth grade test. So we did that. The correlation, by the way, was about 0.7 between the two tests. But here's the story. I'll give you some. So we tested some of Bill Schmidt's stuff on what kind of math he's doing. And of course, the coefficients got much smaller in terms of once you do it. Because you're not doing a real value added. You're just controlling for a measure of math ability by using the TIMSS test. And you're saying, okay, now we have, in addition to social class, we have a measure a year earlier of math ability of the kids as measured by TIMSS. Okay? There's error in the TIMSS, there's error in the PISA. Okay. But, so controlling for the TIMSS and social class, what happens to the PISA scores? And we try to measure it because we now, unlike the PISA test, we had the teachers from the TIMSS test, and in Russian schools, it's basically in 88% of cases, it was the same teacher in the 8th grade and the 9th grade. So basically we had a teacher, all the teacher variables, how she taught, because TIMSS has tons of data on how teachers teach, etc. So we used all that. We didn't find much. You know, we found that if a teacher had been trained in mathematics rather than in a pedagogical institute, learned math in the Pedagogical Institute, but had rather majored in math in the university, the kids got significantly higher results. Then we divided into groups of social class, 3 social class kids. And we also divided by the initial test score on the TIMSS into 2 thirds. We found a very interesting result, which speaks a little bit to your point, David. In the highest test score, initial test score category on TIMSS, top third, that's where the gap between girls and boys was the greatest. In the highest level, not the lowest. And so why might that be true? Well, unlike other places, you're able to get all the items, okay? You know, you're not allowed to get all items, but we were able to look at all that. And what we found was that very few people answered the hard items on the PISA. Very hard to find a large enough set. I don't know if you know how these tests are given, but not everybody gets the same booklet. There are 13 or 14 different booklets. And that's why you get plausible value, 5 plausible values of the test. But so they don't give everybody the same booklet. In 2012, in PISA, we only did math. I don't know if you know this as well, but every year they pick one subject, and it goes in 3 years, 3 9-year cycles. So in 2003 and 2012 it was math. Everybody gets a math booklet. But on the other 2 tests, only 40% of the kids get questions. And they basically impute the values to the other kids. So you get much lower variation on the other 2 tests because you have predicted values for 60% of the kids. But in this math thing, if you look at the hard items, our theory, we'd have to test it, but our idea was that the TIMSS is a test of what is taught in the curriculum, basically. And so the problems look like math problems. If you look at the hard items on the PISA, they look like physics problems, but they're not called physics problems. They're called math problems. So, for example, one very hard item is a revolving door, and you're supposed to use geometry to figure out how much time you have to get through this revolving door under certain conditions. That's a physics problem. Okay, it's applied math. If I see this problem, and unless I'm been prepped, which I think a lot of students in these countries are, Estonia, for example, we have evidence of that, that unless you're prepped to be ready for that kind of problem, you see that problem on a test, and even if you're good in math, you get freaked out. You know, this is not a typical math problem that's given to you in school. So what happens is, I think that the female students get even the high scoring ones get to these hard problems, and they look at them and they don't do them. Okay, and so they score lower. Meanwhile, the easier problems, the lower scoring kids, look very much like TIMSS problems. They're not these hard physics problems. They're basically math problems. There's maybe a few more words to read, but otherwise they're the same. So I think there's some very interesting results, but you got to at least do value added to figure that out. You got to figure out what's going on. Just looking at the benchmark, you don't get it. You don't really get it. I mean, you could divide by the PISA scores and also see the same thing, but you wouldn't be able to explain very much by just looking at the PISA score. And about how much test scores explain, I think you're right. The one study, there are lots of studies of this, but Murnane, Willett, and Levy did a study back in the mid-90s looking at subsequent longitudinal surveys. And in the 1980s in the high school and beyond, they found, when you control for level of education, they found that the test score, one standard deviation of test scores gave you a coefficient of 9% more wages. So one standard deviation of test score is a lot, by the way, it's from the 50th to the 85th percentile. So that's a big leap. So no intervention that we know of, except living in Massachusetts in that particular period,
2003 and 13, does more. If you get a 0.3 standard deviation increase, I mean, you're off limits practically. It's very hard to get that kind of change. So that means that even with outstanding interventions, you might get a 3% increase in wages. You know, your intervention, which I mean, is significant but pretty small.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We are unfortunately out of time, and some of us have to go to class, and maybe others can stay a little bit longer. But I would like to thank from the bottom of our hearts for a great lecture and great conversations. Thank you for all the questions, and yeah, we're extremely grateful to have you here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is for the- This is for the doctoral students, faculty. CASB is organizing another 2 distinguished lectures between now and April. Rebecca Carroll coming.
Oh, is she coming down here?
Yes,
When is that? In March?
April.